Hi, I'm James, and this is a Christian's interpretation of Exodus chapter 12, from verses 1 through to 42. In the last section, we saw the final cycle of plagues and Yahweh's display of his own uniqueness. That cycle ended with Moses warning Pharaoh about the final plague, that every firstborn son from Pharaoh to the slave would die, along with livestock. He also said that God would protect Israel. As we recall these things, we're left somewhat perplexed. Why is Israel in danger like Egypt are? And if Israel is in danger of the next plague, how will God protect them from it? These are the big questions that chapter 12 will answer. Moses had left Pharaoh at the end of chapter 11, and now in chapter 12, verse 1, he and Aaron are receiving instructions from Yahweh. First of all, Yahweh tells us in verse 2 that this month is to be for you the first month of your year. What Yahweh is going to do in this chapter will be fundamental to Israel. Indeed, they're going to order their year around it. This chapter will serve as the template for the relationship God has with his people forever. In verses 3 through 13 here, Yahweh explains in great detail a sacrificial meal that each household of the Israelites are to undertake. They are to select and to care for, to kill and to eat a 1-year-old lamb without defect, along with some bread made without yeast. They are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and the tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lamb. And in the morning, they are to destroy, to burn anything that's left over. This is a one-off meal. It's not to be made use of again. In verse 11, they are to eat it, prepared to leave, dressed and ready to go, ready for the call to depart Egypt. It feels fraught with urgency. Eat it in haste. And the effect of this sacrifice meal, verses 12 and 13, when Yahweh passes through Egypt in the evening and he sees the blood on the doorframe, he will pass over. He will literally spare that house whilst pronouncing terrible judgment on those houses of Egypt that do not bear the sign. Amid the wailing and the grief in Egypt, Israel will be protected. And here we get the answer to our two questions from earlier. Israel are in danger of God's plagues because, just like Egypt, they deserve judgment. Though in previous plagues God had protected them, we realise here with Israel that it was not because they deserved protecting for being especially righteous or anything, but rather God wanted to protect them. When he comes in judgment, Israel are just as deserving of the punishment of death for their sin as Egypt is. Now, we're not given any details of Israel's sin here, so we can't speculate. But it is clear that they are deserving punishment. This means that God's plan to protect them in chapter 11 is astounding, and leads to our second question, which is, how can a God who is perfectly just protect those who absolutely deserve punishment? Well, the God who is perfectly just protects those who absolutely deserve punishment by, chapter 12 tells us, giving them instructions to sacrifice a lamb. When he sees its blood on the doorframes of Israel, he spares those households. God's judgment of Israel's sin is somehow dealt with by the death of a perfect lamb in the place of the people under that house. God is showing in this that we all need a sacrifice to be made right with him. None of us are right with him on our own terms, and the only means of becoming right with him is by the shedding of blood. This is the development of a theme we have seen before. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden in Genesis 3, God slaughtered animals to cover them with clothes. He made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. This is the first sacrifice in the whole of Scripture. This is the nature of all creation. Sin's cost is blood and death. Indeed, when Abraham and Isaac went up the mountain to sacrifice to the Lord, and Isaac said, "But where is the lamb for burnt offering?" Abraham was certain that God would provide the lamb for the burnt offering, for the sacrifice. And when they go up, and when they get to the top of the mountain, there in the thicket, a ram caught by its horns, a sacrifice, Abraham was certain that God would provide. Though chosen by God, because of their sin, Abraham and Isaac needed a sacrifice to be made right with him. And so too in Exodus 12. That which is true of the whole of nature is made explicit for the people of God, that there needs to be a sacrifice to be made right with the God of absolute justice. This will form the bedrock of Israelite life, up till the exile and their return, until Jerusalem fell in AD 70. But this begs the question, how could the lamb represent the household? And then the whole people of God? How could the sacrifice of a lamb take away punishment for sin? Who would regard the sentencing of a lamb to prison or to death in the place of a convicted murderer just? The Passover shows us our need of a sacrifice to take the just punishment of God for our sinfulness. The Passover is effective in taking away guilt in Exodus 12 because over 1,000 years later, Jesus, God in human flesh, came into human history to die so that we could be forgiven our offences against God himself. Indeed, the Lamb of God would come into creation to take away the sin of the world. This is God's chosen one who comes to free us from what otherwise would be death. By shedding his blood on the cross, the same night as Jews all over Jerusalem were slaughtering lambs in remembrance of Exodus 12, Jesus Christ became the true Passover lamb, sacrificed for all. This quote here, Paul is talking to a church in the 1st century AD, and he talks about the leaven, the dough, this idea that the yeast is a symbol of sin and brokenness. And he says, get rid of the old yeast so you may be new. And the reason for that is because Christ has been sacrificed. The Passover lamb has been sacrificed. That is why sacrifices of the Old Testament have power, because they point to Christ's sufficient death. That is why we have no need of sacrifice now in the modern day, because the sacrifice of Christ made once for all, 2,000 years ago, is sufficient to make us right with God now. So we see here in Hebrews, which is a letter written to the New Testament church as well, the author's comparing the Jewish practice with the Christian understanding. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties again and again, offering the same sacrifices. From Exodus 12 through to the point at which the author here is writing, lambs had to be sacrificed every year. Later we'll see more details of other sacrifices need to be made for forgiveness. Sacrifice upon sacrifice, blood upon blood, all through the years. But the author's clear here, the blood of a bull, the blood of a lamb can never take away sin. But when this priest, this is Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, namely himself, his work was finished. He sat down with God, and he waits even now, because by the one sacrifice of himself, he has prepared perfection for us all. God tells us in Exodus 12 that everybody is guilty of sin and deserving of death. And he points through the Passover lamb to Jesus, the one through whom we can be saved. In 12:14-20, Yahweh details a future celebration. This day, the day that Yahweh spares Israel and brings them out of Egypt, is to be remembered for each generation. Verse 17 makes it clear, because it was on this day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Remember the work that Yahweh had done among you to bring you out of Egypt. It's imperative to remember this. and they will remember it by removing leaven, yeast, from their houses, by eating bread without yeast for that ceremonial week. Now Moses teaches Israel more about this in chapter 13, so we'll leave comment on that until then. But we'll get some hints in the narrative as we go on through this section. So in verses 21 to 28, Moses has heard God's instructions and he takes them to the elders of Israel. And he delivers the instructions about the sacrificial meal and the exodus to come to the people. Moses teaches the elders of the importance of explaining this ceremony to their children. In verses 26 and 27, it's key that we remember the importance of this. What is it about? It's about God passing over, sparing Israel through the sacrifice of the lamb, rather than entering them in judgment. Another notable point in this section is that we see a transformed people of Israel in verses 27 and 28. When we last saw them in chapter 5, they refused to believe Moses' word from God because they were so discouraged from slavery. But now, even before they see the Passover fully achieved, they are rejoicing in who God is and trusting in his word, bowing down and worshipping. In 29 and 30, Yahweh executes his justice against the Egyptians. He strikes down all of the firstborn in Egypt. Now, you might wonder why the firstborn. Note, we've previously thought that the whole people of Egypt are deserving death for their evil. And yet again, we see that God has chosen not to kill all of them for some reason. We're not given details. Although earlier in Exodus we are told that this is God's mission to free his firstborn from among all people, namely Israel. So perhaps we can see a parallel there. Verse 30 tells us of the grief, the aftermath of God's judgment on the Egyptians. There was loud wailing, for there was not a house without somebody dead. Yahweh's judgment was effective, but so too was the sacrificial salvation that Israel received. Now we see here Pharaoh is finally convinced to let Israel leave in 31 through 32. He's not seemed reasonable for a long while, but finally it seems he's ready to recognise the authority of Yahweh and to release the people of Israel. There's no bartering, no terms, only a frantic urging to leave and a brief pleading for blessing. The Egyptians too urge Israel to leave, just as Moses said in chapter 11. The Israelites receive silver and gold and clothing as they ask, as they hurry out of the country. Indeed, they're in such a rush that in verse 34, they take their dough before the yeast was added. Verse 37 to 39 summarise the Israelites' journey from Egypt to Succoth and indicate the substantial growth that God's people have experienced in their subjugation, from the 70 or so that went into Egypt back when Joseph was around, to the 600,000 or so plus at this time. In verse 39, Israel bake loaves with the dough that they'd brought out of Egypt. And we're told yet again that the dough was without yeast. As we read this, it becomes clearer that the Feast of Unleavened Bread will be a reminder to the people of the hurried way in which they left Egypt, with half-prepared dough on the eve of the Passover. Verses 40 and 41 tell us that finally, the declaration that God made to Abraham back in Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14, has been fulfilled. I'll just read that. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be a stranger in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions." Now, it seems the Lord was rounding down back in Genesis 15. But so much of that detail is clarified for us and is fulfilled very clearly. And at verse 42, we are left with an instruction to the reader to hold the night they were released as a vigil to honour the Lord for his watch and care over the people of Israel. The Exodus caused the people of Israel to be released. Pharaoh finally permitted God's people to be free, but we might ask, why did the Passover happen? Why did God go through with it this way? The Passover showed Israel that they needed saving from God's wrath, and evidence that they could be saved by a sacrifice. The sacrifice was the means by which the just God could have a relationship with a sinful people by forgiving their sins through the blood which points to the blood of the eternal God shed on the cross. That divine blood shed to allow all to enter into relationship with him by trusting in him. Today, you and I are in need of that divine Passover lamb, Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, to be made right with God. As we draw to the end of this section, we're encouraged to trust in Jesus' sacrificial death, to enjoy new life and eternity with him. Thank you so much for watching today's video. As always, I'd love to hear from you if you've got thoughts or questions. Do please drop me a message if you'd like. I'd particularly love to know what you make of that encouragement, that challenge to trust in Jesus' sacrificial death for new life in him. Do you trust in that work? If you don't, why not? I'd love to discuss that further with you if you'd like to have a conversation.